There was something screaming out in the darkness that night, and when I finally found what was making that sound, everything I thought I understood about the creatures living in these remote valleys was shattered completely. What began as the most brutal winter season of my entire career in wildlife management became something I still struggle to put into words, even after all these years have passed. I'd been working as a wildlife biologist for nearly 16 years when I accepted that winter assignment. The state needed someone to maintain the remote research station through the coldest months, monitoring the weather equipment and keeping records on animal activity in the area. The station had been set up years earlier to study elk migration patterns, but budget cuts meant they couldn't staff it full-time anymore. They needed a volunteer to overwinter there, someone who could handle months of isolation and harsh conditions. The compensation was decent, and honestly, I needed to get away from everything for a while. The research station was basic but functional. There was a main building with a wood-burning stove that served as the heating source, a cramped sleeping area off to one side, and a small kitchen setup with a gas-powered stove and a collection of canned goods that would last through the winter. The agency had installed a satellite communication system for emergencies. Plus, there was an old radio receiver that could pick up weather broadcasts when atmospheric conditions cooperated. The location was deep in the backcountry, nearly 50 miles from the nearest actual town, accessible only by a rough dirt road that became completely impassable once the heavy snows arrived. They would send in supplies by helicopter every 4 to 6 weeks, assuming the weather cooperated enough for flight. The solitude didn't bother me much. My relationship had ended badly the previous spring, and I had grown accustomed to spending time alone. The quiet in those mountain valleys was absolute and complete. There were no sounds of civilization, no rumble of cars on distant highways, no neighbors making noise, no constant ping of phone notifications. Just the whisper of wind through the evergreen branches, the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness, the distant howl of a coyote pack communicating across the ridges. The first several weeks went by without any problems. Each morning I would bundle up and make my rounds, checking the various monitoring stations scattered around the research area, recording data, noting any wildlife sightings. The rest of my time was spent maintaining the cabin, gathering and splitting firewood, reading through the small library of books previous researchers had left behind, preparing simple meals from my supplies. The evenings I spent sitting near the warmth of the stove, listening to the forest gradually settle into its winter rhythms. By the middle of December, snow had accumulated to nearly 4 feet in the low areas, with drifts piling much higher against any obstruction. Temperatures were plummeting steadily, dropping below zero on most nights. I had experienced plenty of severe winters during my career, so none of this was unexpected. I had made thorough preparations and had everything required to wait out whatever the weather brought. The major storm system arrived a few days before Christmas. The weather broadcast had been warning about it for nearly 3 days beforehand, describing it as an extreme winter event with life-threatening wind chills and potential whiteout conditions throughout the region. I spent those preparation days hauling in additional firewood, filling every available container with water in case the pipes froze, double-checking my food supplies and emergency equipment. The storm rolled in during the early hours of a Wednesday morning. Within 2 hours, the wind was screaming through the valleys, and snow was falling so thick and heavy that I could barely see the edge of the tree line from the cabin windows. The temperature plunged to 25 below zero, then 30 below. The wind gusts were powerful enough to make the entire cabin structure shudder and creak. I stayed inside and focused on keeping the fire burning strong. Every few hours, I would peer out through the frost-covered windows, but there was nothing to observe except an endless wall of white. The blizzard continued with that intensity for 3 full days. Snow accumulated against the cabin walls in massive drifts, some reaching heights of 7 or 8 feet. The world had become nothing but howling wind and swirling white. On the 4th day, the wind finally began to diminish. Snow continued falling, but more gently now, no longer driven horizontal by the gale. I could actually make out the shapes of nearby trees again, dark silhouettes visible through the steady curtain of descending flakes. The temperature remained dangerously cold, hovering around 20 below. That night, after the worst of the storm had finally passed, I was huddled near the stove, working my way through an old mystery novel, when I heard something from outside the cabin walls. My first assumption was that it was just residual wind gusts, or perhaps the sound of an overloaded branch finally snapping under accumulated snow weight. But then the sound came again, and it was clearly neither of those things. It was some kind of scream, not entirely human-sounding, but not exactly like any animal I could identify either. The pitch was high and desperate, emerging from somewhere out in the frozen forest. The sound would stop for a minute or two, then begin again. Each repetition seemed weaker than the last. I sat there in the dim light of the cabin, straining to listen, trying to convince myself it was just a coyote in distress, or maybe a wounded deer making its final protests against the cold. But something about that particular sound unsettled me deeply. There was a quality to it that I couldn't quite categorize, something that reminded me uncomfortably of a young child wailing in fear. The screaming continued for perhaps 25 minutes, growing fainter and more sporadic with each occurrence. Eventually, I couldn't make myself ignore it any longer. Something out there in that frozen darkness was suffering, possibly dying. And even though venturing into the forest under these conditions was extremely dangerous, even potentially suicidal, I found myself unable to simply sit in the warmth, doing nothing, while a creature died within earshot. I pulled on every piece of cold weather gear I owned, grabbed the most powerful flashlight from my equipment, and pushed open the cabin door. The cold struck me like a physical assault, an immediate and profound reminder of just how lethal that environment was. The moisture in my breath crystallized almost instantly, forming ice in my hair and on my eyelashes. The snow had drifted so deeply that movement was incredibly difficult. The screaming was coming from roughly the northeast, toward the dense old-growth timber that covered the valley slopes. I began forcing my way through drifts that reached above my waist in places, following that sound of distress. The forest around me was unnaturally silent except for that desperate screaming. No wind rustled the branches now, no nightbirds called, just that terrible sound of something suffering. I had struggled perhaps 200 yards through the snow when my flashlight beam swept across something unusual ahead of me. Initially, my mind registered it as a dark boulder or perhaps a section of fallen tree trunk, but then it shifted slightly and the screaming intensified. I pushed closer, my pulse hammering in my temples. What my flashlight revealed in that pool of white light made me freeze completely in my tracks. It was small, roughly the size of a human child of 5 or 6 years, covered entirely in thick, dark fur that had become matted and crusted with ice and frozen snow. The creature was huddled into a tight ball at the base of an enormous old pine tree, shaking with violent tremors. Even through the layer of accumulated snow, I could tell this was something I had never encountered before in all my years studying wildlife. The face was partially human in its features, partially something else entirely, something more primitive. The hands were oversized for the body, with elongated fingers that were clutching desperately at the creature's own shaking form. A young Sasquatch looked up at me with enormous dark eyes that held both terror and a strange sort of desperate hope. The screaming stopped immediately. The creature just stared at me, either too exhausted or too frightened to make any further sound. I could tell instantly that this young one was dying. The fur was rigid with ice formation. The violent trembling was already beginning to weaken. a dangerous sign of severe hypothermia progressing toward the final stages. I stood there rooted in the snow for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, my brain struggling to reconcile what my eyes were clearly showing me. Every logical, rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Sasquatch was not real, but I had studied wildlife for nearly 2 decades. I knew what I was seeing. This creature was far too large to be any known animal species, and far too small to be an adult of whatever it actually was. The face had too much human quality to it. The eyes that watched me held too much obvious intelligence behind them. The young creature made a soft, whimpering noise, much weaker than before. The dark eyes began to flutter closed. I made my decision in that instant. Whatever this being was, it was dying right in front of me. I could not simply stand there and watch that happen. I stripped off my heavy outer coat and wrapped it around the small, shaking body. The creature offered no resistance whatsoever, too weakened and cold to fight anything anymore. The young Sasquatch was heavier than I expected, probably between 60 and 70 pounds, significantly more than a human child of comparable size would weigh. I gathered the bundle into my arms and began the brutal journey back toward the cabin, fighting through the deep snow with every step. The creature made no sounds now. I could barely detect any breathing. I pushed myself harder, genuinely terrified that this thing would die before I could get it to warmth and shelter. The return trip to the cabin while carrying that weight through the deep snow was one of the most physically demanding things I had ever done in my life. The extreme cold, the deep drifts, the weight of the young creature, everything combined to turn a 200-yard distance into an agonizing ordeal. By the time I finally kicked the cabin door open and stumbled inside, my arms were burning with exhaustion and I was gasping for every breath. The warmth of the cabin enveloped us both immediately. I laid the small Sasquatch down on the floor near the stove, unwrapping my coat from around its body. In the better light of the cabin interior, I got my first truly clear look at what I had discovered. The young one was clearly immature, probably equivalent to a human toddler if I had to estimate based on proportions and development. The body was built like a small but powerfully muscled human child, covered from head to toe in thick brown fur with reddish highlights. Only the face, the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet were bare of hair. The face was deeply unsettling in how it combined human and more primitive features. There was a flattened nose, a pronounced brow ridge, lips that looked remarkably human. The eyes were closed now, the breathing shallow and much too fast. Ice was clinging to the fur all over the body. This young Sasquatch was in severe hypothermic crisis and would not survive much longer without immediate intervention. I grabbed every towel I had and began vigorously rubbing the small body, trying to restore circulation, trying to generate friction warmth. The creature remained unconscious through my efforts, completely unresponsive to the rough stimulation. I worked on that young Sasquatch for what must have been 2 hours or more, slowly warming the small body, carefully thawing the ice from the matted fur, monitoring for signs of life. At some point, the violent shivering started again, which I recognized as actually a good sign. It meant the body was regaining enough function to try warming itself. The breathing gradually became deeper and more regular. Sometime in the early hours before dawn, the eyes opened. Those enormous dark eyes looked up at me with confusion and fear, but also with something else underneath, something that might have been recognition of help received. The young Sasquatch made a soft sound, not the desperate screaming from before, more like a questioning murmur. Then the eyes closed again, and the creature slipped into what seemed like natural sleep rather than unconscious collapse. I sat back against the cabin wall, utterly exhausted, looking at this impossible being sleeping on my floor. My mind kept trying to reject what I was seeing, kept insisting there had to be some rational explanation. But there was no rational explanation. I had a young Sasquatch in my research station, alive because I had gone out into a deadly blizzard and brought it back. The young one woke up around midday. The eyes opened and immediately focused on me with an intensity that was almost unnerving. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The young Sasquatch was pressed back against the wall near the stove, clearly frightened but too weak to attempt any kind of escape or defense. I moved slowly and deliberately, keeping my body language as non-threatening as possible. I had a bowl of water ready, and I slid it across the floor toward the creature without getting too close. The young Sasquatch watched the bowl approach with obvious suspicion, then looked back at me with those penetrating dark eyes. Eventually, thirst overcame fear. The young creature reached out cautiously, grabbed the bowl with those large hands, and drank deeply. Water spilled down through the fur around the mouth, but the young Sasquatch kept drinking until the bowl was empty. When finished, the creature set the bowl down and looked at me again, the expression somewhat less fearful now. Over the next several days, a very gradual trust began to develop between us. I offered food in small amounts, trying various items from my supplies to see what the young Sasquatch would accept. Fresh fruit was received enthusiastically, as were nuts and certain vegetables. Meat was also eaten readily. Anything heavily processed or artificial was rejected after a single suspicious sniff. By the end of the first week, the young one had recovered enough strength to move around the cabin. I watched with fascination as the creature explored the small space, touching things with those long fingers, examining objects with obvious interest. The young Sasquatch was clearly intelligent, displaying problem-solving abilities that went far beyond simple animal behavior. When I accidentally left a cabinet open that contained food supplies, the young one figured out within minutes how to open other cabinets and began systematically investigating their contents. Communication began to develop gradually. The young Sasquatch made a variety of sounds, from low rumbling vocalizations to high-pitched chirps and clicks. I started to recognize patterns, certain sounds that seemed to express hunger, others that might indicate contentment or curiosity or alarm. I began responding to these vocalizations, and the young one quickly picked up on the fact that I was trying to communicate back. I settled on calling the young one Little One, in my own thoughts and speech, which seemed neutral enough. By the second week, the young Sasquatch would sometimes approach me voluntarily, usually when hungry or thirsty, but occasionally just to be near another living being. The first time the little one actually touched me intentionally, reaching out to feel the texture of my jacket sleeve, felt like a significant breakthrough. I began to notice personality emerging as the young Sasquatch recovered and gained confidence. The little one was curious about everything, constantly wanting to examine new objects, explore new areas, understand how things worked. There was playfulness too, moments when the young creature would toss objects around or make games out of simple activities. And there was affection, tentative at first but growing stronger, displayed through proximity and soft vocalizations and eventually physical contact. One of the most remarkable developments was the young Sasquatch's rapid learning ability. I had started unconsciously naming objects as I used them, saying things like water or fire or food out loud without really thinking about it. Within days, the little one had begun imitating some of these sounds, rough approximations of human words produced by a vocal apparatus, not designed for human speech. The word for water became something like wata, food became something like fu, but the meaning behind the sounds was clearly understood by both of us. About 3 weeks into our cohabitation, something happened that changed the dynamic significantly. The little one had been particularly subdued that day, spending long periods staring out the windows toward the forest. Late in the afternoon, the young Sasquatch suddenly became very agitated, rushing to the window and pressing against the glass, making sounds I hadn't heard before. something between a cry and a call, different from any vocalization I had yet observed. I went to the window and looked out, but couldn't see anything unusual. But the little one kept making that calling sound, increasingly desperate, clearly trying to communicate with something out there. Then I heard an answering call from the forest, deep and resonant, nothing like the higher-pitched sounds the little one made, but clearly the same type of vocalization, an adult sound. The little one went absolutely wild with excitement, bouncing and calling and pressing against the door. I understood immediately what was happening. Someone had been searching for this young one, someone who had finally tracked the trail to this cabin. A parent. I opened the door, letting the cold air rush in, and the little one bolted outside without hesitation. I grabbed my coat and followed, watching as the young Sasquatch plunged through the snow toward the tree line with an energy I hadn't seen before. From the shadows between the trees, a massive figure emerged. My breath caught in my throat as I got my first look at an adult Sasquatch in full form. This one stood well over 8 feet tall, with enormous shoulders and arms that hung past the knees. The fur was darker than the little one's, almost black, with just hints of brown. The face was broader, more heavily structured, with eyes that held ancient intelligence and assessed me with an intensity that made me feel thoroughly examined down to my core. The little one reached the large Sasquatch and was immediately swept up in an embrace. The sounds they made together were like nothing I can adequately describe. Something between crying and singing, communication that carried profound emotion even though I couldn't understand the specific meaning. The large Sasquatch held the little one tightly, checking for injuries, smelling, touching, clearly verifying that the young one was alive and well. Then those dark eyes turned to look at me, standing in the doorway of my cabin, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. What would this creature do now? The large Sasquatch set the little one down in the snow and began walking toward me. The stride was powerful and deliberate, covering ground with a speed that was somewhat alarming. I forced myself to stand still, not to retreat into the cabin, though every instinct was screaming at me to put a solid door between myself and this approaching creature. The adult Sasquatch stopped about 10 feet from where I stood. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. I could see now that this was clearly the little one's father based on something about the features, some familial resemblance that translated across species lines. Then the father did something I did not expect. He reached out one enormous hand and placed it flat against my chest, just above my heart. The touch was firm, but not threatening, warm despite the cold air, and held there for several seconds. Then he withdrew the hand and made a sound, deep and resonant, that carried unmistakable meaning even without understanding the words. Gratitude. Thanks. The little one came to stand beside me and tugged at my hand. The young Sasquatch looked up at me with those dark eyes I had come to know so well over the past weeks and made sounds that included some of the words we had developed together. Sounds that seemed to mean come and family and safe. I realized they wanted me to go with them. Part of me recoiled from the idea, fear of the unknown, fear of these powerful creatures, awareness of how vulnerable I would be in their environment. But a larger part was overwhelmed with curiosity and with something else, a sense of connection that made refusal feel impossible. I bundled up in my warmest gear, secured the cabin as best I could, and followed the two Sasquatches into the forest. The place they eventually brought me to was a kind of natural shelter, formed where several enormous fallen trees had created an enclosed space covered by accumulated snow and debris until it was essentially invisible from any distance. Inside, it was surprisingly warm, protected from wind and insulated by the snow covering. More Sasquatches were waiting there. There were 5 adults in total, including the father, plus 3 other young ones who were clearly older than my little one. The father made sounds that were clearly explanations, gesturing toward me, toward the little one, telling the story in their own language. I saw immediately which one was the mother. She was slightly smaller than the father, but still enormously larger than me, with fur that had more reddish tones and a face that held the same basic features as the little one. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the father's scrutiny seem casual by comparison. This was a mother who had lost a child and now found it again, and I was the stranger who had held that child through the intervening time. She approached me slowly, her gaze never wavering. The other adults watched in tense silence. She stopped directly in front of me and stood there for a long moment, her dark eyes searching my face, reading things in my expression and posture that I couldn't begin to hide. Then she reached out and touched my face, her leathery palm surprisingly gentle against my cold cheek. She made a sound, low and emotional, and I saw something glistening in her dark eyes. Tears, or something very like them. She was crying. She pulled me into an embrace so suddenly I had no time to react. Her arms wrapped around me, enormous and powerful but incredibly careful, and she held me against her chest while making sounds that needed no translation. Relief, gratitude, overwhelming emotional release. I found myself crying too, all the tension and strangeness of the past weeks somehow coming to a head in that moment. When she finally released me, something had fundamentally shifted in how the group regarded me. I was no longer a stranger, no longer a potential threat. I had been accepted. Over the following days, I was treated as something between a guest and a member of the family. They fed me, sharing their food stores, which consisted of dried meat, roots, nuts, and various preserved plant materials. They made space for me to sleep in the warm shelter, surrounded by massive furry bodies that radiated heat. I began to understand their social structure during this time. The group was an extended family unit, led by the eldest adult, the little one's grandfather as I came to understand it. Their intelligence was staggering. These were beings with culture, with tradition, with emotional complexity that rivaled or exceeded human levels. Spring began to arrive gradually, the days lengthening, the temperatures moderating, the snow slowly receding. My time at the research station was drawing to an end. Soon, the access road would be passable again, and my replacement would arrive to take over the monitoring duties. I would have to leave this place, leave the forest, leave the remarkable beings I had come to know. The day before the helicopter was scheduled to arrive, the entire family came to my cabin. It was extraordinary, seeing all of them together in the daylight at the edge of the clearing. The grandfather approached me carrying something in those ancient weathered hands. It was a stone, smooth and dark, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The grandfather placed it in my palm and wrapped my fingers around it, making sounds that the little one partially translated. Remember, family, return, keep safe. The stone was warm from the grandfather's touch, surprisingly heavy for its size, clearly something of great significance. The little one was last, and the hardest. The young Sasquatch clung to me for a long time, making soft sounds of distress, not wanting to let go. I held the little one close and whispered promises I hoped I could keep. I would come back. I would not forget. The bond we had formed would not be broken by distance or time. When I finally released the little one into the mother's waiting arms, the young creature looked at me with those dark eyes that I had come to love and made a sound that might have been my name, or as close to it as that vocal apparatus could produce. Then, the family turned as one and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees like ghosts, like they had never been there at all. The helicopter arrived the next morning. As we loaded my equipment, I looked toward the tree line one last time. Several large shapes were visible in the shadows between the trunks, watching, making sure I departed safely. I raised my hand in a wave. One smaller shape stepped forward slightly and waved back, the little one, saying goodbye one more time. Then they melted into the forest and were gone. I carried the carved stone in my pocket as the helicopter lifted off. I told my replacement it had been a quiet winter, just me and the forest. Nothing eventful to report. What I had experienced was so far outside normal reality that telling the truth would have seemed like madness or an elaborate joke. Years passed. I continued my career in wildlife biology, though my perspective had shifted fundamentally. I understood now that there was so much more to these forests than anyone officially acknowledged. Last autumn, nearly 12 years after that transformative winter, I was working at a site about 35 miles from the original research station. One crisp October morning, I hiked out to the clearing where I had first returned the little one to the father all those years ago. The place looked unchanged by time. I stood in the clearing, remembering everything, when I heard a sound from the trees. A low, rumbling call that I recognized instantly. From the shadows beneath the massive pines, a Sasquatch emerged into the gray autumn light. This was no longer a child, no longer the little one I had known. This was a young adult, standing perhaps 7 feet tall, powerfully built, covered in rich brown fur with those familiar reddish highlights. The eyes, though, the eyes were the same, dark and deep and unmistakably familiar. The young Sasquatch walked toward me with confidence, stopping just a few feet away. Then the Sasquatch did something that made tears spring immediately to my eyes. One large hand reached into the fur and withdrew a small carved stone, similar to but different from the one I still carried. The stone was held out to me, offered with a gesture I recognized, the same gesture the grandfather had used all those years ago. I took the stone with trembling hands. It was warm and smooth, carved with careful symbols, a gift, a continuation of connection, a way of saying that memory had persisted across the years. I reached into my own pocket and withdrew the original stone I'd been given. When I held it up, the Sasquatch's eyes widened visibly. A soft sound of surprise and joy emerged, recognition that I had kept the gift, that I had remembered, that the bond remained unbroken despite time and distance. We stood there in the clearing for a long while, two beings from different worlds, connected by a winter of extremity and care. Eventually the Sasquatch turned to go, but before disappearing into the trees, my former little one looked back and raised one large hand. I raised mine in return, mirroring the gesture, holding it there as the Sasquatch vanished between the trunks like mist dissolving in morning light. When people ask me now if I believe in Sasquatch, I tell them that I believe in mysteries, in things that exist beyond our current understanding, but I never tell them about the young Sasquatch I found dying in the snow that winter night. Some stories are not meant for general telling. Some experiences need to remain protected, kept safe from a world that would not understand and might well destroy what it could not comprehend. The family in the forest deserves their privacy. The best thing I can do for them, the best way I can honor what they gave me, is to keep their secret. But I know the truth. I know that we share these mountains with beings of remarkable intelligence and profound emotional capacity. The crying in the forest that night led me to something extraordinary. What started as rescue became relationship. What seemed like an ending became a beginning. And now, years later, I carry the evidence of that miracle with me always, a reminder that compassion creates bonds stronger than species boundaries, that kindness echoes across years and lifetimes, that we are capable of connection with beings we never imagined existed.